Antoinette Frank was a police officer sworn to protect, but instead she became a murderer. In this video, we'll explore how this trusted cop went from serving her community to committing a heinous crime, murdering her partner and 2 innocent teens in cold blood. We'll take you through the chilling details of the crime, the investigation that led to her capture, the punishment she received, and the fate that still awaits her on death row. Her story is one of betrayal, justice, and a haunting reminder that even those sworn to protect us can turn into killers. Antoinette Renee Frank was born on April 30, 1971 in Louisiana. On the surface, she seemed like any other woman with a dream, wanting to rise above her circumstances and serve her community. But behind the quiet demeanor was a story filled with deep scars, pain, and emotional wounds that would one day make headlines across America. Antoinette grew up in a troubled household. Reports later revealed that her childhood was marked by physical and emotional abuse. Her father, a strict and sometimes violent man, reportedly subjected her to years of control and trauma. These early experiences would have a lasting impact on her mental health, shaping her behavior and decisions well into adulthood. Despite the challenges at home, Antoinette was determined to change her life. She wanted to do something meaningful. She believed that joining the police force would give her a sense of purpose, respect, and stability. The uniform, the badge, and the title of officer all represented something powerful to her, an escape and a new identity. In the early 1990s, she applied to the New Orleans Police Department, NOPD. But from the start, there were red flags. She struggled during her psychological evaluation. Experts at the time concluded that she lacked the emotional stability and decision-making skills needed for police work. One evaluator even stated that she should not be hired under any circumstances. Yet somehow, she made it through. The NOPD was under pressure at the time. The department was short on officers and struggling with rising crime. Some believe that Antoinette was hired simply because the department needed more recruits, even if they weren't fully qualified. Regardless of how it happened, she was issued a badge and gun, officially becoming one of New Orleans' newest police officers in 1993. At first, Antoinette seemed quiet and reserved. Her fellow officers said she didn't stand out much. She was often shy, avoided confrontation, and lacked confidence during patrols. Some officers worried that she wasn't assertive enough to handle dangerous situations. Others noticed that she seemed distant, even withdrawn, as if she were always somewhere else mentally. Still, she was now part of the force, patrolling neighborhoods, responding to calls, and enforcing the law. She wore the same badge as the rest, but something was different. She never fully fit in. She didn't earn the respect of her peers, and many questioned whether she was cut out for the job. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. Antoinette's desire to be respected, loved, and valued led her down a dark and dangerous path. It wasn't long before she met someone who would change her life forever, a man who would drag her deeper into crime and betrayal. As her personal life spiraled out of control, the badge she once wore with pride became a mask hiding her true self. This was the beginning of a tragedy that would shake the nation and mark Antoinette Frank as one of the most notorious figures in American criminal justice history. New Orleans in the early 1990s was a city caught between beauty and violence. Tourists came for jazz, food, and culture, but beneath the surface was a city battling high crime, drug wars, and public mistrust of the police. Antoinette Frank stepped into this environment wearing a uniform that was supposed to bring peace, but for her, it became a cover for something else. As a new officer, Frank was assigned to regular patrols. She worked side by side with veteran officers who quickly noticed that something wasn't quite right. She was quiet, often unsure during tense situations, and rarely took initiative. She lacked the command presence most officers developed quickly on the street. Her field training officer, Ronald A. Williams II, was one of the few who tried to guide her. Williams, just 25 years old himself, was a promising officer, disciplined, smart, and well-liked in the department. He saw potential in Frank, but also understood her weaknesses. He tried to help her adjust to the demands of police work, but even he began to express concerns about her readiness for the job. Then Antoinette met Rogers Lacaze, a young man with a criminal record and a dangerous influence. He was heavily involved in drugs, street crime, and was known for carrying weapons. Despite his background, Frank formed a close and eventually romantic relationship with him. It was a shocking connection. A police officer falling for a known felon. Colleagues noticed her spending time with Lacaze. Some saw him driving her patrol car, wearing her uniform jacket, and even handling her service weapon. These weren't small violations. They were serious breaches of department policy and safety. Officers reported her behavior to superiors, but not much was done. It was as if the system didn't want to deal with the problem. Frank's relationship with Lacaze deepened. She began to trust him more than her fellow officers. He became her world, her partner, not in law enforcement, but in lawlessness. Together, they plotted to get money fast, and Antoinette's access to information, guns, and locations made her the perfect inside partner. One of their frequent stops was a Vietnamese-owned restaurant called Kim An, located in a quiet part of town. The owners welcomed police officers and often allowed them to eat free or hang out there during breaks. Frank and Williams both knew the place well. The restaurant's friendly atmosphere and family staff made it a safe spot for officers to relax. But to Frank and Lacaze, Kim An became something else. They saw it as a target. They believed there was money inside. They believed the trust they'd built with the family and staff would make it easy to carry out a robbery. What no one knew was that Antoinette Frank, a sworn officer of the law, was preparing to betray that trust in the most horrific way. The lines between cop and criminal had vanished. The uniform had become a disguise. And soon, the city of New Orleans would be shaken by one of the most shocking crimes in its history. It was a quiet Saturday night on March 4, 1995. At the Kim An restaurant in New Orleans East, the small Vietnamese family that owned the place was preparing to close. The atmosphere was calm. Officer Ronald Williams was there on an off-duty security shift, something many NOPD officers did to earn extra income. Antoinette Frank had also stopped by earlier, chatting with the staff and blending in like she always did. But behind her calm face was a deadly plan. Frank had already spoken with Rogers Lacaze. They had made up their minds. They were going to rob the restaurant. They believed there was a lot of cash stored in the back. Frank had inside knowledge of the layout, where the money was kept, and who would be on site. She also knew that Officer Ronald Williams would be there. He wasn't just her former partner, he was a respected and well-liked officer. But he stood in the way of their plan, and that made him a target. Around midnight, Frank and Lacaze arrived at Kim An. Lacaze was armed with a stolen MAC-10 submachine gun. Frank had her police-issued handgun. They entered the restaurant through the front door like normal customers. The family had no reason to suspect anything. They knew Antoinette. They trusted her. But that trust was shattered in seconds. Lacaze pulled his gun and opened fire. In the chaos, he shot and killed Officer Ronald Williams at close range. Williams never had a chance to draw his weapon. He died instantly. A fellow officer gunned down by the very person he once tried to help. Frank and Lacaze forced two members of the Vu family, Ha Vu, 17 years old, and her brother Quang Vu, 21 years old, into the restaurant's cooler. Then in cold blood, Frank shot both of them in the head. It was a brutal execution. The restaurant, once filled with laughter and food, became a crime scene soaked in blood and fear. But the killers didn't realize that someone else was still alive. Sarah Vu, just 24 years old, had managed to hide during the chaos. She crouched inside a dark freezer, barely breathing, and waited in silence. She had seen everything. She had heard the gunshots, and she had watched as a trusted police officer murdered her siblings in cold blood. After the shootings, Frank did something unthinkable. She returned to the crime scene pretending to be a responding officer. She tried to control the investigation, asking questions and giving instructions as if she were doing her job. But her performance fell apart quickly. Sarah Vu came out of hiding and told the officers on the scene exactly what happened. She pointed at Antoinette Frank and said, "She did it. That's her. She killed them." The truth was out. Frank was arrested on the spot. The NOPD and the entire city were in shock. A sworn officer had just murdered a fellow cop and two innocent civilians in cold blood. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a nightmare that no one could have imagined. The arrest of Antoinette Frank sent shockwaves across New Orleans and the entire country. A police officer sworn to protect now stood accused of murder. For the New Orleans Police Department, NOPD, it was a moment of crisis. How had one of their own committed such a cold-blooded crime? And how did no one stop it before it was too late? As Frank sat in handcuffs at police headquarters, investigators scrambled to piece together the events of the night. What they found was disturbing. A pattern of red flags, poor oversight, and a system that failed to act when it mattered most. Frank was immediately questioned. At first, she denied everything. She claimed she had nothing to do with the murders. She acted confused and tried to maintain her role as a fellow officer, insisting she had simply shown up after the shooting. But her story didn't hold up. Witnesses placed her at the scene during the crime. Surveillance footage showed her arriving with Lacaze. Most damning of all, Sarah Vu, the surviving family member, clearly identified Frank as one of the killers. Sarah's calm yet emotional statement broke through all doubt. "She killed my brother and sister. She was in uniform." When pressed further, Frank began to crack. Investigators noted her shifting stories, lack of emotion, and strange behavior. Her responses were cold and distant, as if she wasn't fully grasping the horror of her actions. Eventually, she admitted to being present during the robbery but tried to blame everything on Rogers Lacaze. She painted herself as a victim, manipulated, scared, and not truly involved, but the evidence said otherwise. Frank had helped plan the robbery. She had unlocked the doors for Lacaze. She had fired her weapon, and she had returned to the crime scene in uniform to cover her tracks. Her badge was no longer a symbol of service. It was now evidence of betrayal. Lacaze, meanwhile, was also arrested quickly. He showed no remorse. Investigators found his fingerprints on the weapon used in the killings. He too tried to shift blame, but couldn't escape the overwhelming evidence against him. As the case developed, a troubling truth emerged. Frank never should have been a police officer. Her psychological evaluation had raised serious concerns years earlier. One expert warned that she was unfit for duty, but those warnings were ignored. The department, desperate for recruits, had lowered its standards, and now an innocent officer and 2 civilians were dead. The media exploded with coverage. Headlines screamed of a killer cop. News outlets replayed the story again and again. A female police officer turned murderer, an insider who betrayed the very system she was sworn to uphold. For many, it was hard to believe. But the truth was undeniable. Antoinette Frank was not just a suspect. She was now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in the system. And the road to justice was just beginning. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, notebooks in hand, cameras rolling outside. Citizens of New Orleans, still shaken by the brutal murders at Kim On restaurant, wanted answers. And at the center of it all sat Antoinette Frank, once a trusted police officer, now a woman facing the death penalty. The trial began in September 1995, just 6 months after the murders. Prosecutors wasted no time building their case. Their message was clear. This was no robbery gone wrong. This was planned, premeditated, and cold-blooded murder carried out by someone who used her badge to get close before pulling the trigger. Assistant District Attorney Roger Jordan painted a picture of betrayal. He described how Frank had misused her uniform and her position, how she had unlocked the doors to let her partner in crime, Rogers Lacaze, carry out the attack, and how she had executed 2 innocent teenagers and a fellow officer, all for money. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics showed that the bullets recovered from the victims matched Frank's service weapon and the MAC-10 used by Lacaze. Fingerprints confirmed Lacaze's presence. Security footage placed them both at the restaurant at the time of the crime. And most powerful of all, Sarah Vu, the lone survivor, took the stand. With steady emotion, Sarah recalled the horror of that night, the sound of the gunshots, the screams of her siblings, and the moment Frank stood before her in uniform, a weapon in hand. Her testimony brought the courtroom to tears. She pointed directly at Frank and said, "She shot them. She killed my brother and my sister." Frank's defense attorneys struggled to present a different version of events. They argued that Lacaze was the mastermind, and that Frank acted out of fear. They portrayed her as emotionally unstable, vulnerable, and manipulated. But the jury didn't buy it. The cold, calculated actions before, during, and after the murders were impossible to ignore. Adding to the courtroom drama was the presence of Rogers Lacaze, who was tried separately. His case mirrored Frank's. The jury in his trial also heard damning evidence, including the fact that Frank had allowed him to wear her police gear and ride in her patrol car during earlier shifts. Their relationship wasn't just inappropriate, it was dangerous from the start. During Frank's trial, former NOPD colleagues testified about the many warnings they had raised about her behavior, the times she had let Lacaze drive her patrol car, and her emotional instability. The department had ignored the red flags, and now everyone saw the tragic result. On October 20th, 1995, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty on all counts. Less than a week later, the sentence was handed down: death. Antoinette Frank became only the second woman in Louisiana's history to receive the death penalty, and the only female police officer in U.S. history sentenced to die for murder. Justice had spoken. But for the families of the victims and the city of New Orleans, the wounds would remain for years to come. The verdict was clear. The sentence was final. Antoinette Frank was officially sentenced to death for the murders of Officer Ronald Williams, Ha Vu, and Quang Vu. For many, it was justice delivered, but for the city of New Orleans, the scars left behind would not heal so easily. When the sentence was announced, Frank showed little emotion. She stood quietly as the judge read out her fate: death by lethal injection. Her face was calm, almost distant, but inside the courtroom, the families of the victims cried. Officer Williams's widow wept, clutching a picture of her husband in uniform. The Vu family mourned the loss of their two bright young children, murdered in cold blood by someone they had once trusted. Frank was immediately transported to the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, where she would await execution. She was placed in solitary confinement, locked away from other inmates. Her world shrank to a small cell with thick concrete walls and iron bars. No more badge, no more authority. Just time, endless time to reflect on her choices. Death row wasn't a place of noise or chaos. It was quiet, it was cold, and it was lonely. Antoinette Frank, who once wore the blue uniform of the New Orleans Police Department, was now prisoner 94018. A convicted killer and a disgrace to the badge she once wore. Outside the prison, the case continued to stir emotions across the country. People were still shocked that a police officer, especially a female officer, could be capable of such brutal acts. It wasn't just the crime that haunted people, it was the betrayal of trust. Frank had not only killed, she had used the very tools of justice to commit her crimes: her badge, her gun, her access, and her knowledge. In prison, Frank maintained her innocence. She gave interviews claiming she was manipulated by Rogers Lacaze, that she never wanted to kill anyone, that things went wrong. But few believed her. The evidence was too strong, the lies too many. Meanwhile, appeals began. Her defense team filed motions, arguing that she didn't receive a fair trial, that her psychological state had not been properly considered, and that the death penalty was too harsh. But the courts stood firm. Over and over, her sentence was upheld. Rogers Lacaze too was sentenced to death, but later had his sentence reduced to life without parole after appeals. Still, he remained behind bars, just like Frank. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Frank had become a symbol, a cautionary tale of what happens when red flags are ignored, when systems fail, and when power is given to the wrong hands. Her story was studied in police academies and criminal justice courses across the country. It wasn't just about murder, it was about the failure of accountability. To this day, Antoinette Frank remains the only female police officer in U.S. history to sit on death row. Her story is one of shattered trust, broken lives, and the steep price of betrayal. Once a police officer, now a convicted killer, Antoinette Frank began her new life behind bars on death row. Locked inside the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, her world was stripped to the bare minimum. No badge, no gun, no authority. Just 4 concrete walls, a metal bed, and the ticking of time. Unlike the general prison population, death row inmates live under tighter restrictions. Frank was kept in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. Her contact with others was limited. No friends, no fellow inmates to talk to. Just guards, bars, and silence. She was allowed 1 hour of recreation per day, alone in a small outdoor cage. Meals were passed through a slot in her cell door. Conversations, when they happened, were short and monitored. For someone once trained to walk boldly into crime scenes and command attention in uniform, this was a different kind of punishment. She had authority once. Now she couldn't even control the light switch in her cell. Despite her quiet surroundings, Antoinette wasn't forgotten. From time to time, journalists requested interviews. True crime podcasts and documentaries revisited her story. Her case was studied in law schools and by reform advocates discussing police psychology, corruption, and the flaws in recruitment systems. Frank rarely spoke publicly, but when she did, she often claimed she was misunderstood. She blamed her actions on fear, manipulation by Lacaze, and emotional instability. She never fully accepted responsibility. Even years later, she tried to rewrite the narrative, positioning herself as a woman pushed too far, caught in a dangerous relationship. But the evidence never changed. Neither did the facts. Prison staff described her as quiet, withdrawn, and compliant. Some said she showed little emotion. Others noted she spent most of her time reading, writing, or staring into space. She had few visitors. Her fellow officers, who once stood beside her in uniform, had long since turned away. The badge she once wore now symbolized betrayal, not service. Over the years, Frank filed several appeals, hoping to overturn her conviction or reduce her sentence. Her lawyers cited her unstable mental health, the alleged influence of Lacaze, and errors during the trial. But appeal after appeal failed. The court stood by the original decision. The death sentence remained. Outside the prison, the victims' families tried to move on. Officer Ronald Williams's family continued to honor his legacy as a fallen hero. The Vu family rebuilt their lives with heavy hearts. The community never forgot what happened inside Kim An restaurant that night. It wasn't just a crime, it was a wound on the soul of New Orleans. As of today, Antoinette Frank remains on death row, waiting for a date that has never been set. In Louisiana, executions have slowed down, but the sentence still stands. She is alone with her memories, her regrets, if any, and the choices that led her to this place. She entered the prison as a former cop. She now lives as a permanent inmate, marked by history, haunted by the past, and forever tied to one of the most shocking betrayals of justice in U.S. law enforcement history. The news of Antoinette Frank's arrest and conviction sent shockwaves through the city of New Orleans and far beyond. It wasn't just another headline about a crime. This was different. This was a police officer, a woman sworn to protect the public, committing a cold-blooded triple murder, including the killing of one of her own fellow officers. Outrage erupted. In neighborhoods across New Orleans, people asked the same question. How did this happen? How did someone with clear signs of emotional instability and questionable behavior get hired as a police officer? The community had trusted her. The Vu family, who had welcomed her into their restaurant like family, had trusted her. Officer Ronald Williams, who worked beside her, had trusted her. The betrayal stung deeply. New Orleans was already struggling with high crime rates, racial tension, and public mistrust of law enforcement. The Antoinette Frank case poured gasoline on that fire. Talk radio, news stations, and community meetings lit up with debate. Some citizens feared that if someone like Frank could get a badge, others like her might already be on the force. The New Orleans Police Department, NOPD, faced harsh criticism. Journalists uncovered that Frank had failed parts of her psychological exam during the hiring process. Experts had warned she might not be emotionally fit for duty, but her application was pushed through during a time of officer shortages. She was hired anyway. This failure of oversight triggered major calls for reform. People wanted to know what background checks were done, who ignored the warnings, and how many other dangerous officers had slipped through the cracks. Across the country, other police departments began reviewing their recruitment and vetting policies. The Antoinette Frank case became a case study in what not to do when hiring someone to carry a gun and wear a badge. The media also played a huge role in shaping public opinion. Newspapers described Frank as a killer in uniform, while TV stations aired reenactments and courtroom sketches. True crime magazines ran dramatic covers, and national news outlets like CNN and ABC News ran features on the case. Documentaries and crime shows later covered the story, each time reigniting public interest and horror. For the families of the victims, the attention was painful but necessary. They wanted people to remember Ronald Williams, the heroic officer who died in the line of duty. They wanted the world to know that Ha and Quang Vu were more than just names. They were children with dreams, lives that mattered. But not everyone was focused on justice. Some people questioned whether Frank's gender played a role in how she was portrayed. Was the public more outraged because she was a woman? Did her role as a female officer make the betrayal feel deeper? These debates continued long after the trial ended. In the end, Antoinette Frank's crimes left more than just 3 victims. They shattered public trust, exposed cracks in law enforcement systems, and left a permanent stain on the badge. Years have passed since Antoinette Frank was sentenced to death, yet no execution date has been set. As she remains on death row, many wonder what her final words might be when that day comes. So far, Frank has never expressed true remorse for the murders of Officer Ronald Williams and the Vu siblings. In rare interviews, she has blamed others, especially Rogers Lacaze, portraying herself as a victim of manipulation. But the questions still haunt the public. Why did she really do it? Was it greed, desperation, or something darker? How did someone so unstable become a police officer? Could the tragedy have been prevented if red flags weren't ignored during her recruitment? Even now, legal motions and appeals occasionally surface, but none have changed the outcome. Frank remains the only female police officer in U.S. history sentenced to death, a title steeped in disgrace. For the victims' families, there is no closure, only painful memories and anniversaries. And for many in New Orleans, the case left behind an uneasy truth: that the shield of law and order can be misused, and sometimes the threat comes from within. As the years tick by, one question lingers: will justice ever truly feel complete? Antoinette Frank's case exposed deep flaws in police recruitment and trust. Her actions stained the badge and shattered lives, a chilling reminder: evil can wear a uniform. For more gripping true crime stories, subscribe now and stay informed on the darkest corners of justice and betrayal.